Welcome back to Murder, Mystery and Mayhem. Today we travel from Callington in the Adelaide Hills of South Australia to the suburb of Seacliff and the bloody, senseless murders of Pirjo, Kemppainen and Redman. Two elderly, vulnerable women who lived 60 kilometres apart and had never met, but whose names would be forever linked. Not because they were murdered only 2 months apart, but because their killers were all in their teens. Not something we would normally suspect of such brutal, horrific crimes. In fact, at the time of the murders, South Australian Supreme Court Judge Margaret Nyland had faced the agonising task of sending children to prison for murder 3 times in the last 18 months of her career, including 18-year-old Jason Alexander Downey for the slaughter of an entire family at Kemppainen, a case I have covered in a previous video. I'll leave the link at the end. In fact, aggressive acts committed by teens had reached such levels that a debate had been sparked over the possible cause, and included the use of violent video games. Many professionals have argued for and against. Sure, there have always been pockets of aggressive use in society. The flick knife brandishing rockers of the 50s, the skinheads of the 70s, and the Asian gangs of the 90s. But a constant rise in the number of gruesome, bloody murders committed by teens with no apparent motive is cause for concern. Is it exposure to domestic violence? Sometimes, but that has been a social problem for many decades. Is it the underage use of alcohol or illicit drugs? Again, a problem among youths for many years. Although today's synthetic drugs, such as ice, are known to increase aggression, they are often not an underlying factor in these cases. Is it a generation of permissive parenting, waning school discipline, desensitisation to violence through rap lyrics and video games? Perhaps it's none of these factors. Perhaps a combination of some or all. I'd love to read your opinion in the comments section below. Pirjo Kemppainen was a 63-year-old retired nurse who lived alone at her Callington home. In the early hours of September 11, 2010, she was awoken by the crash of a rock being thrown through her glass door. Pirjo called the police assistance line. The call taker submitted an incident report, but sadly did not pass the call on to the communications centre to dispatch a patrol. This would later become part of an internal investigation. Meanwhile, 2 teenage boys, both just 14 years old, stood beneath a tree outside and watched. For legal reasons, we'll call them Miller and Stephen. Satisfied that no patrol car was coming, Miller asked Stevens who would stab her first. They were both armed with knives, but Stevens was becoming unsure. Annoyed, Miller returned to the house alone and knocked. Pirjo appeared from her laundry and asked him why he had thrown the rock through her glass door. "I'm drunk," Miller replied, then stepped forward and stabbed Pirjo in the stomach. She tried to defend herself, and Miller stabbed her in the stomach a second time, then began to stab her about the head. Unhappy with the result, he took a large rock from the garden, and before Pirjo could close the wooden laundry door, he threw it at her, knocking her down. He then retrieved another rock and struck her with it repeatedly until she lay dead. He would later testify that he finished his gruesome act by dropping the rock on Pirjo's head. Returning to Stevens, with blood covering his hands, face and clothing, Miller said, "I did it. I killed her." Both boys then ventured back inside the house, leaving bloody footprints and fingerprints. Later they returned to Miller's home, where Miller cleaned himself up and the pair fell asleep in front of the TV. 16 hours later, Pirjo's brother found her bloody, beaten body on the laundry floor. She had sustained 58 stab wounds to her body, head and neck, and 69 blows from the concrete rock. Blood from her injuries was spread across the walls and floor of the laundry. The following Monday, Stevens was standing as usual in his school uniform at the bus stop opposite Pirjo's house, now cordoned off by police. A friend who sat near him on the bus that morning reported that he discussed the murder in some detail, including the large limestone rock used to kill her. This piece of information had been withheld from the public. When later asked about Stephen's demeanour during their conversation, the boy said he appeared to look happy about it. 2 youths had been captured on CCTV cameras wandering the streets in the early hours of that morning, but police had not connected them to such a brutal murder scene. Now they moved in, searching Stephen's home and finding a bloody T-shirt hidden under his mattress. It would later prove to be that of Pirjo Kemppainen. Bloody foot and fingerprints were matched to the pair and they were arrested the following day. Miller was keen to banter about the murder. When asked by a psychiatrist why he had done it, he replied, "I don't know. I just felt like killing someone." Miller had been exposed to domestic violence before his parents finally divorced. When his mother remarried and his stepfather accepted a job interstate, Miller chose to stay with his father in Callington. His life in the small town was marked by social isolation due to a low intellectual function. His only friend was Stevens, who lived in the same street, and the boys spent much of their time stealing beer and playing video games during sleepovers at Miller's house. He threatened neighbourhood children with knives and offered to murder a teacher's partner. He dreamed of attending his high school reunion with an automatic weapon so he could mow them all down. "I was obsessed with killing people," he would later admit. "From year 1 to year 8, I've just had thoughts about killing people." Those thoughts were fuelled by violent movies, video games and pornography. The protagonists of Scarface, Saints Row and Gears of War were his role models. His idea of fun was slicing a virtual person in half with a chainsaw. To a susceptible mind like his, such games were desensitising. Forensic psychologist Luke Broomhall, who treated Miller, stressed this was not true for all cases, only those who lacked the ability to separate fantasy and reality. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Miller agreed to testify against his co-accused. His testimony easily ranks among the most chilling moments in the state legal history. He rarely blinked and spoke in a monotone voice, totally detached from the horrific details he was providing. He only became animated when he spoke of his obsession with the movie Scarface and his video games. Miller testified that on the night of September 10th, he told Stephen that it was time to kill someone. He chose Kemppainen because she was alone and vulnerable. They stole beer from a neighbour's fridge, played video games and practised their stabbing technique on an old mattress. Just after midnight, they left to fulfil their plan. Miller's testimony did little to help the prosecution. In fact, when he calmly stated that he believed Stevens had snitched and added proudly, "I'll get him back once he's inside. I wish I had a hammer so I could smash it over his jaw," he actually helped the defendant's case, who had portrayed Stevens as a naive boy who thought Miller was bluffing about killing Kemppainen. Then he was caught up in fear once he realised she was dead. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty, and Stephen walked from the court with his parents, free. Justice Nyland sentenced Miller for the murder of Pirjo Kemppainen, giving him a life sentence with a minimum 15 years in prison without parole. The discount on his sentence was in part a recognition of his diminished mental faculties. Miller's case was reviewed when he turned 18 to determine whether he had proven himself capable of reform before being transferred to an adult prison. Testimony from psychologists and staffs at the Juvenile Detention Centre stated that upon hearing of another elderly woman's murder a few months later, Redman, he had boasted, "I've started a revolution." He also expressed his glee through amateur rap lyrics, like "Don't ever think you can befriend me, because I'll cut you so gently. I will turn your bedroom into a bloody frenzy. Don't think I can ever change." Miller was transferred to Yatala Prison, which houses some of the hardest criminals in the state. He will become eligible for parole in 2025 and will be 29 years old. 87-year-old Redman had lived in her home in the seaside suburb of Seacliff since 1952. She and her husband Philip had purchased the home soon after emigrating from England. In her younger years, Anne had worked as a model and had served in the Women's Royal Auxiliary Air Force. Sadly, Anne was left a widow when her husband died in 2005, but she continued to live independently with her beloved dog Spotty. Two of her sisters and one of her daughters lived nearby. On the 25th of January 2012, Anne had a brief phone conversation with her daughter Susan, and the two discussed getting together the following day, which was Australia Day. When Susan arrived at 5:40 p.m, she was surprised to find Anne's front door wide open, knowing how security conscious her mother was. She knew something wasn't right and immediately called her husband Chris, who arrived shortly afterward. Making his way through the house, he could find no sign of Anne, and he moved to the backyard. Susan would later say that she saw her husband's knees buckle as he made his way back to her. She knew the news was not good, but nothing could prepare her for what was to come. Chris had discovered Anne's body laying in the backyard. She was covered in blood and her throat had been cut. Further investigation by authorities would reveal she also had multiple fractures to her face and back. There were defence wounds on her arms. Anne had suffered a vicious attack. A search of the house revealed that the power had been turned off at the main box, and the screen on the back toilet window had been cut. Louvers of glass had been removed, leading police to believe this had been a burglary gone wrong. But why had the perpetrator chosen to carry out such a brutal attack on an elderly, vulnerable woman? Traces of blood were found through the house, which proved to belong to Anne, and it appeared that the attacker had fled from the yard, through the house and out the front door, leaving it open as he left. Anne was wearing a nightdress, which suggested the attack had occurred sometime during the previous night or early hours of that morning. A search of surrounding homes found that 3 more had had power turned off at the mains, indicating that the attacker had tried a number of homes before Anne's. Almost a month later, and with little to go on, police were no closer to finding Anne's killer, and her daughters made a heartfelt plea to the public for help. Elderly residents of the seaside community were on edge, many refusing to leave their homes. A month later, in March, police made an announcement that they were in the process of interviewing 66 possible suspects, all known for committing house break-ins. but none of these people emerged as a key suspect. A Crime Stopper hotline was set up, and by April they had received 65 calls, but none provided any viable leads. 8 months passed before they finally received information from a member of the public. Someone had started to talk to friends, and those conversations were passed on to police. The media and public were unaware that police had begun to make progress in building a case against 2 key suspects. The 2 persons of interest had no criminal background or any history of violence. They were teenagers, aged just 16 and 17 at the time of the murder. For legal reasons, we'll call them Ryan and Alex. They had come to the attention of police through tips from friends who had either heard directly or through the grapevine of their involvement. Ryan, the younger of the pair, came from a good home and was the son of a serving South Australian police officer and a nurse. He was a participant in sporting activities outside his work as a chef and was apparently well liked by his peers. Alex also came from a stable environment, but was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 11 and struggled at school. This led to him leaving school early, and he began an apprenticeship as a chef. But Alex soon began to slip into antisocial behaviour. The 2 friends shared occasional recreational drugs, but neither had a criminal record. After Ryan completed Year 11, he also left school and followed Alex into a chef apprenticeship. Unfortunately, Ryan soon lost his job, and with it the income and independence he had come to enjoy. He began to explore other ways to make money, and before long the 2 boys were robbing houses together. This is what led them to Redman's house on that fateful night. After turning off the power at the mains box and wearing gloves and balaclavas, Ryan and Alex moved to the back of Redman's home. They cut the fly screen from the back window and began to remove the louvers of glass. One dropped and broke, prompting Alex to quickly climb inside. In his haste, he stood on the toilet cistern, causing it to flush. The noise woke Anne, and she made her way to the bedroom light, but it failed to come on. Making her way through the house, she tried more switches to no avail. Anne retrieved a torch and wearily made her way to the backyard. The small light from the torch was enough for her to see Ryan, crouched behind a bin. Before she could react, Ryan came forward and punched her, knocking her to the ground. By the time Alex appeared from the house, Ryan was sitting on Anne, pinning her down. Alex returned to the car they were driving and retrieved a blunt hunting knife. When he returned to the yard, Ryan was still sitting on Anne. Alex would later testify that he said, "I thought you would have knocked her out by now." And Ryan replied, "Knock her out? I'm going to kill her." Ryan then took the knife and began to cut Anne's throat. It was blunt, so he had to keep cutting. Ryan would testify that Alex came back with the knife and handed it to him, saying, "Do it, or I'll kill both of you." Whatever the true version of events, Anne now lay dead, 7 cuts to her throat, and blood pooling around her tiny body. Over the following months, the boys would brag about the murder to friends. Alex gave the hunting knife to a friend and said, "You might want to clean it. I did something bad. Someone died by that knife." Later, when they were questioned by police, Alex contacted the friend and told him to get rid of the knife. The friend threw it in the ocean, but later came forward, and police found the knife 10 days later. The boys had also taken Anne's torch as a trophy, and it was found in the boot of Alex's car. They could not be ruled out as a match to DNA found under Anne's fingernails. They were arrested and brought to trial. Alex at first pled not guilty, then changed to a guilty plea, and the pair were tried together. Supreme Court Justice Margaret Nyland sentenced both, who were now 18 years old, to life in prison with a 20-year non-parole period. They would both go on to fight the severity of their convictions, but in a unanimous decision, their case was dismissed by the Court of Criminal Appeals. These two women, who had dedicated themselves to the service of others, Pirjo as a nurse and Anne by serving in the Royal Air Force, had done nothing to deserve such a violent and brutal end to their lives. Thank you for watching. Please leave a like before you go and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more murder, mystery and mayhem. Until next time.